Hello, we are the Law and Policy Group, and we are presenting on basic conditionals. First off, what are conditionals? Conditionals are if statements that tell a program to execute different commands depending on whether a condition is true or false. So we can see in this picture here that when enter is pressed and there's a condition in the text, it can go one of two ways, true or false. And depending on whether it is true or false, then it will print out different commands. And we use conditionals because it allows a program to do multiple things. So while defining a variables, there are three types of variables in Python, and that is integers, strings, and doubles. Integers are whole numbers, for example, 3, 5, and 10. Strings is an ordered sequence of characters, so it can be anything from the word hi to the number 3, but in quotation marks. And doubles are numeric values with decimal points. And the thing about variables is that they cannot be added on top of one another. And Python is dynamically typed, which means that the same box that can hold an integer can also shift so that box holds a string. And changing that box from an integer to a string means that Python is dynamically typed.
So there are a few general forms of conditionals in conditional statements: if statements, elif statements, and else statements. So for if statements, if the expression is true, the statement is executed. If the expression is false, the statement is not executed. This principle holds true also for elif statements, except there are multiple elif statements within a block of Python code that are allowed, unlike if statements. And if a if statement executes, the elif statement does not execute. And lastly, the else statement comes at the end of a block code. It can be combined with an if statement, and it only runs if the above conditionals do not run. And unlike elif statements, there can only be one else statement. So as previously mentioned, these statements can be used within a kind of like chain together. And so this shows an example of how these different conditional statements would be used. So as you can see, if the first statement is true, only the first conditional if statement would execute. But if it was false, each elif statement would then therefore be evaluated for true or false, and accordingly run or not, depending on whether it's true or false. And then at the end, if none of the above statements were true, the else statement would execute. And then here's just another example of how you would use these conditional statements together. So either just an if statement, a if statement in the beginning, and a else statement at the end, or an if statement at the beginning, an else statement at the end, and then multiple or one, depending on what the code is, multiple elif statements in the middle.
Let's go through a few example problems to practice what we just learned. The code to the right allows us to input a number, and depending on what condition is satisfied in the if, elsif, and else statements, which we learned about earlier in this video, something different will be printed. So looking towards the first problem, what will be printed if we input 2? So we'll go through the if, elsif, and else statements from top to bottom, and we'll check the first condition, if x equals 2. So in this case, x does equal 2, and we'll run the command underneath the if statement, which is print 2. So the string 2 will be printed. And then what happens if we input 3? Well, the first condition of if x equals 2 isn't satisfied, and so we'll move down to the else if statement. Does x equal 3? In this case, yes, and then we'll run the command print x. So in this case, that's just the number or the integer 3. Then what happens when we input 5? So we'll go down the if statement again. X does not equal 2, x does not equal 3, and so then it falls into the else category, and we'll just print the command x minus 1. In this case, 5 will substitute for x, and so 5 minus 1 equals 4, and so we'll be left with the integer 4. We can also write conditional statements that use strings and not just integers. So the code to the right has us input a string, and then we have a conditional statement to verify the string that we have inputted, and then we'll print out, in this case, an integer. So if you want to take a second to pause the video and brainstorm what this section of code could be telling us, what's the purpose of these quick 7 lines? So the purpose of this code when I wrote it was that one could input their political party affiliation, in this case Democratic, Republican, or other, and the code would print the likelihood that they would vote for the Democratic candidate. So for example, if you inputted that the person was a Democrat, there would be a 100% chance that they would vote for the Democratic candidate. If you inputted Republican, it would be a 0% chance. And then if you inputted something else, there would be a 50-50 chance on whether or not they would vote for the Democratic candidate. And just to do one more practice problem with this line of code, what would be printed if we input the letter or the string D? So we would go again top to bottom and check, does X in this case equal D? In this case it does. We could ignore the bottom 2 statements and we'll just print 1.